EAA's webinars are made possible through the generous support of Aircraft Spruce and Specialty, serving home builders and EAA members since 1965. Tonight's presentation is titled Doing GA Single Pilot IFR Better. Our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He's author for numerous aviation pubs. He's a CFI, A&P mechanic with IA authorization, aviation maintenance technician of the year in 2008, a member of EAA. Hey, Mike, thanks for being with us tonight. I'm going to control the presentation over to you.
Well, thanks, Tim, and good evening, everybody. I'm glad to, I've been actually on the road for the last 2 months, living out of the back of my airplane in a suitcase. And I think I've put about, 45 hours on the airplane in the last 2 months, mostly on the East Coast. I just returned home Monday afternoon, and it's awfully good to sleep in my own bed for a change. And during the last 2 months, I was flying at 100% single pilot IFR. So this is a kind of a fresh topic. It's a little bit different from what I usually do. Typically, my EAA webinars are maintenance oriented, but I thought we would do a change of pace here and talk a little bit about the pilot side of things. As Tim mentioned, I'm a CFII, and I've been flying instruments for nearly 50 years, mostly single pilot. The thing that this presentation is based on is a very interesting study that was commissioned by the Aviation Safety Reporting System, the NASA ASRS system, years ago, back in 1981, actually, where they asked Battelle Laboratories, a research company, to study 5 years of reports of mostly of general aviation single pilot IFR errors that the pilots reported on an ASRS form, or in some cases controllers reported on an ASRS form, and see if they could find some patterns in the information to try to figure out what sort of mistakes pilots were making flying single pilot IFR. And the study, as I said, analyzed 5 years of IFR pilot deviations that had been reported to ASRS by pilots and controllers. And every so often I dust this study off and read it again, and am convinced that the conclusions are just as valid today as they were 36 years ago when the study was done. Because basically we're dealing with the same kinds of human beings flying the airplanes, and they tend to make the same kinds of mistakes. Some of the findings of the Battelle study were pretty counterintuitive. For example, they found that hours don't count. The problems experienced during single pilot IFR did not show any correlation with the experience or inexperience of the pilots involved. In fact, more than half of the deviations were reported by pilots that had more than 2,000 hours total time and flew more than 50 hours in the last 90 days. So these were very, very active and experienced pilots that were making these errors. It also turned out that there was no significant difference in the types of problems experienced by high-time pilots versus low-time pilots, or by pilots of larger aircraft versus smaller aircraft. Those conclusions I found kind of surprising, because one would just intuitively expect that higher time pilots and pilots of larger aircraft would make fewer mistakes. but it turns out that they don't. The conclusion of the study was that the remedies to the problems of the GA pilots face flying single pilot IFR don't lie in more training or having more experience, but rather changing the nature of the single pilot IFR task itself through improved cockpit discipline. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the next half hour or so. The reports that were studied in the Battelle study were overwhelmingly pilot deviations. There were some reports where pilots were complaining about inadequate ATC service, but by and large, the study was focused on mainly pilot deviations. So we'll talk about pilot deviations, and here's a breakdown of the kinds of deviations, the broad classes of deviations that Battelle found during the study. By far, the largest number, 43%, were altitude busts of some sort of or another. Bad approaches and heading deviations each accounted for around 20%. Position deviations, where an aircraft was simply off course, about 10%. Loss of control, 5%, and other 2%. So altitude deviations were by far the largest segment of the stupid pilot tricks that that came out in this study. And the altitude deviations came in a number of flavors. The overwhelming majority of the altitude deviations were where a pilot was in a climb or a descent and overshot the assigned altitude. Some other kinds of altitude deviations that represented a smaller percentage of the deviations were where a pilot changed altitude prematurely, undershot the assigned altitude as opposed to overshooting it, failed to change altitude when ATC instructed an altitude change, or failed to maintain altitude. But the overwhelming majority of these deviations, again, were overshoots where the pilot was climbing or descending and simply didn't stop at the assigned altitude. Why did these altitude deviations occur? Battelle felt that there were two reasons. One was that the pilot got distracted, and distractions are clearly a problem with single pilot IFR, because when workload is high, it's difficult for one person to keep track of everything. The second cause of altitude deviations were that pilots misunderstood or misinterpreted the clearance that they got from ATC, and so didn't really understand what altitude assignment they were getting. And the misunderstandings came in a number of flavors. In the cases where pilots misunderstood or misinterpreted the clearance, about half the time the pilot wound up climbing or descending to an altitude assigned to a different aircraft. Other lesser causes were where they climbed or to flight planned altitude rather than the altitude that they were cleared, to a requested altitude where the request hadn't been granted, but they did it anyway, or in a few cases to the habitually expected altitude where a pilot was flying a route that he flew a lot. He was used to being assigned to a particular altitude, and in this particular case, he was assigned a different altitude, but he climbed to the one that he normally was expecting. So what can we do as pilots to reduce altitude deviations like this? And it seems to me there are several things we can do. First of all, never act upon a climb or descent clearance unless you're 100% sure it was meant for you and not another aircraft. Again, the majority of altitude deviations having to do with misunderstandings or misinterpretations, where an aircraft acted on a clearance that was intended for a different aircraft. So unless you're 100% sure that a clearance was meant for you, always query ATC about it. Verify that this was for November 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A second thing, because the majority of altitude deviations were overshoots, where the aircraft was climbing or descending and then just climbed right through or descended right through the assigned altitude, is that every aircraft that flies IFR really needs to have an altitude alerter. And nowadays you can buy them very, very inexpensively. And I can tell you that an altitude alerter is worth its weight in gold. I don't know how many potential altitude busts my altitude alerter in my Cessna 310 has saved me from. But it's absolutely worth its weight in gold. So if you're flying IFR in an aircraft without an altitude alerter, you really need to put one in. And it isn't very expensive nowadays. There's some very inexpensive ones under $1,000. Third thing we can do, and this is a habit that I developed many, many years ago, is that when ATC assigns you an altitude, don't read it back immediately. First, dial it into your altitude alerter, then read back the altitude that you've dialed into your altitude alerter. If you do it that way, it's impossible to read back the altitude correctly and dial it in wrong. Instead of reading back what the clearance was, you're reading back what you dialed into the alerter. Now, if you don't have an alerter, and you really should have one, then you could use the same procedure with a Post-it note. In other words, when you get an altitude assignment, first write it down, then read back what you wrote. Don't read it immediately and then note it down, because there's a potential for mistake that way. There are some other things you can do. If you have an ADF with a rotatable card, you can use it as an altitude, as a place to dial in altitudes. But an altitude alerter that actually beeps when you are approaching the assigned altitude is really worth its weight in gold. So it's a really good idea to do. Okay, the next most common category of pilot deviations were misflown approaches. They represented 21% of the single pilot IFR deviations. Now, the instrument approach is obviously the most workload intensive phase of any IFR flight. And because it's low to the ground, the consequences of making a mistake can be very, very serious. Interestingly enough, and this was another counterintuitive thing, the study found that there was no correlation between pilot deviations and the type of approach flown. One might reasonably expect that more difficult approaches, typically non-precision approaches with lots of step-down fixes and stuff, would have a lot more pilot deviations than something like an ILS, where you're simply tracking the glide slope and you're not having level offs and that sort of thing along the way. But that's not what was found in the study. Half of the approaches that were screwed up were ILS approaches, which are normally considered to be the easiest of all approaches to fly. A major factor in a lot of these misflown approaches was lack of positional awareness, flying a divergent heading that never intercepted the final, flying a localizer and never intercepting the glide slope, that sort of thing. I think probably if the study were repeated today, there would probably be somewhat less of these, simply because now we all have GPS-driven moving maps in the airplane, which help a lot with situational awareness. Another common error was unexpected course reversals. Typically, the pilot flew a procedure where ATC expected him to go straight in, but the pilot executed a procedure turn or a holding pattern that ATC didn't expect. In one somewhat humorous case, a GA pilot wound up being assigned runway 27 ILS at Chicago O'Hare and wound up making 2 360s, causing the controllers to scatter a whole slew of airliners in all directions because the pilot did something that the controllers didn't expect. I actually, a friend of mine used to work traffic at the Tracon down in Burbank and had the same thing happen, where a pilot was making the approach to Burbank, executed a holding pattern at the outer at the final approach fix that the ATC didn't expect, and my friend had to vector a whole slew of airplanes behind him off the final approach course while he got it straightened out. So don't do that. Controllers don't really appreciate it when you when they expect you to make a straight in approach and you don't. Another thing that the study found was that the probability of a misflown approach was particularly high on second try and third try approaches after the pilot had already missed one or more approaches. So what can we do as pilots to reduce misflown approaches? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, we all have GPS-driven moving maps in our airplanes nowadays, whether they're panel-mounted or yoke-mounted or both, or an iPad or whatever. So use your GPS-driven moving map to help you stay positionally aware so that you don't do something that deviates from the approach. I use a Garmin 696 on my yoke. I have an iPad mounted on my left cockpit window, and I have a Garmin 530 on the panel. So I'm at any given time, I'm staring at 3 GPS moving maps, and if I get off course, there's not much excuse for it. But so the equipment that we have today, or that we have reasonably available today, really helps in this area. Second of all, use your altitude alerter to prevent inadvertent descent below minimums. Most altitude alerters have a decision height feature where you dial in the decision height, and then it provides you an oral alert when you get there. For non-precision approaches where you have a bunch of step-down fixes, dial each successive step-down into the alerter so that you can't bust that altitude. One of the more common kinds of misflown approaches is a non-precision approach with multiple step-down fixes where the pilot gets one step down off and descends to an altitude at the previous step down that he should have descended to at the succeeding step down, and that's a really good way to wind up with a windshield full of rocks. And finally, never make a procedure turn or a hold in lieu of procedure turn unless you're absolutely positive that the controller is expecting it. Nowadays, procedure turns and holding for the approach is the exception rather than the rule, because we're in a radar environment. And so usual procedure turn. Anytime the approach plate says no procedure turn or procedure turn not authorized, or you're getting a radar vector to final, or you're cleared for a straight in approach, that means that ATC is not expecting you to fly a procedure turn or a holding pattern. And if you do, it's going to get them pretty upset because they probably have an aircraft sequence behind you on the approach that they're going to have to break off. And finally, very, very carefully before attempting a second try approach. Are due to one of two reasons. Either the weather was below minimums, or the pilot was too tired or too rusty to fly the approach accurately. In both cases, things aren't going to get better on the second approach. So usually, if you miss an approach, diverting to an alternate with better weather is the wise choice. And a lot of people have augured in after missing an approach and going back for a second or third try. It's the third category are heading deviations. Heading deviations occurred mostly during the departure phase, interestingly enough. 70% of them during the departure phase, 20% during approach or missed approach, 10% during other phases of flight. Again, I found that a little surprising that the departure phase was the predominant phase during which heading deviations occurred, but that's what the study showed. The breakdown of heading deviations, 44% wandered off of the assigned heading, 19% flew the reciprocal heading 180 degrees from what they were assigned. 20% roughly failed to turn to the heading after they were given it, and 9% turned the wrong way. They were asked to turn left to a heading and turned right, or vice versa. So what can we as pilots do to reduce these kinds of heading deviations? First of all, if you don't have a DG or HSI that has a heading bug, you need to put one in. In the same way that we need an altitude alerter to remind us of altitudes, we need a heading bug to remind us of heading assignments. Having a heading bug makes it much harder to forget an assigned heading, or to wander off the heading, or to accidentally turn to the reciprocal, because we dial the assigned heading into the bug, and we have it sitting right in front of us on our compass card, where it's very, very hard to make a mistake. If you have an autopilot with a heading hold feature, and I personally consider an autopilot pretty much a no-go feature item when I'm flying single pilot IFR. In my early days, when I was younger and probably less wise, I did a lot of single pilot IFR without an autopilot installed. But nowadays, if I have an inoperative autopilot, I won't fly more than about an hour single pilot IFR, because hand flying single pilot IFR is just extremely fatiguing. Anyway, assuming you have an autopilot with a heading hold feature, use it, particularly anytime your attention is diverted. If you think about airline operations, those guys fly on the autopilot 99 and 44% of the time, and it's a good habit for GA pilots as well. When ATC assigns you a heading, the same thing that we talked about with altitude applies here. When you get the heading, dial it into the heading bug first, then read back the heading that you dialed into the bug. Don't read back the heading and then dial it. If you dial it first, read it back second, it's impossible to read back the heading correctly and dial it in incorrectly, which is a pretty easy thing to do if you don't follow that procedure. And again, if you don't have a heading bug, and you really should, then use a Post-it note or roadable ADF card or something to record the assigned heading, then read back what you recorded, either what you wrote down on the Post-it note or what you dialed into the roadable ADF card, or whatever you use for a heading reminder. There are a number of different kinds of heading reminders that you can pick up very, very inexpensively. As far as turning in the wrong direction, a heading bug makes it pretty obvious which way is the shorter way to turn. If the controller clears you to turn in the opposite direction, it's usually a good idea to confirm with controller and say, verify that you want me to turn the long way around to whatever the heading is. Sometimes that's the case. That happened to me 2 days ago when I was departing Hawthorne, and controller basically gave me a long way around turn that was a 270-degree turn, but it's kind of an unusual clearance, and I verified it back to him that he wanted me to turn the long way around. You just want to make sure so you don't wind up turning the wrong way, the opposite way that the controller expects inadvertently. Position deviations represented 10% of the pilot deviations, and the position deviation was when a pilot wound up somewhere other than where ATC expected the pilot to be. We've all probably had calls from ATC saying, say your position, or indicating that the controller didn't think you were where he expected you to be. Almost all the reported position deviations reported in this study occurred during the cruise phase of flight, mostly while the aircraft was out of radar contact. I'm just thinking back, the last position deviation that I remember having was a case where I had put a fairly complicated route into my GPS navigator that the autopilot was flying, and I accidentally forgot a fix, and so the airplane was flying what I programmed into the computer, but that wasn't the correct route because I'd left out one fix, and an ATC called me on it. Very embarrassing. And in most cases, in the study, the pilot was not aware of wandering off course until ATC said, say your position, or gave you a turn to re-intercept or something like that. Anyway, what can we do as pilots to reduce these position deviations? Again, use a GPS moving map to maintain positional awareness. A yoke-mounted portable does the job just fine, but you need to make sure that when you program your route into the box, that you do it accurately. And so the trick is to go over your route and make sure that you've entered all applicable turn points, whether they're VORs, whether they're intersections. You have to make sure not to forget any, or you'll wind up going off course. Again, if you have an autopilot that has a navigation tracking feature, use that feature, especially anytime that your attention is diverted. Finally, 5% of the accidents involved loss of control. Obviously, loss of control at IMC can have very serious consequences. And surprisingly, the pilots involved in the reported loss of control situations were all relatively high-time pilots. Again, this is not an experience issue. Most of the loss of control episodes involve pilots who got distracted and focused on something else than flying the airplane. I'm sure everybody remembers that DC-10 crash in Florida many years ago, where there were 3 crew members in the cockpit, and they were all trying to troubleshoot a problem, and none of them realized that the autopilot had disconnected, and the airplane was flying without anybody paying attention, and it very slowly and majestically descended into the Okefenokee Swamp with 3 pilots up in the front office focusing on something other than flying the airplane. Some of the loss of control episodes that came up in the Battelle study were one where a pilot looked down to retune a radio, then looked up to find himself in a steep turn, or got distracted by a screaming infant and failed to notice that the autopilot had disconnected. That sort of thing. They're typically distractions. But not all of them were distraction related. In one case, a pilot attempted an instrument approach in rain and turbulence after losing a vacuum pump and wound up not having any way to keep the dirty side down. In another case, a CFI almost lost it on departure because of a wake turbulence encounter. But most of them were distraction related, and most of them were cases where the pilot was fixating on something and forgot to fly the airplane. So what can we do about these things? Always engage the autopilot whenever you need to divert your attention from non-attitude flying tasks, and monitor the autopilot frequently and make sure that the audible disconnect warning is working, so that if the autopilot does decide to disconnect, you'll know about it. Do what the airlines do: establish and enforce a sterile cockpit rule during the departure and approach phases of the flight. Airlines generally, the rule is that there's a sterile cockpit. Anytime you're below 10,000 feet, that means no talking, and a complete focus on flying the airplane. If you have passengers in your airplane, inform them ahead of time that you can't talk to them during these high workload phases because you don't need the distractions. So at any rate, there are some recurring themes in all of this, but clearly it's all about cockpit discipline. Use a GPS moving map. Use reminder devices like altitudes alerters and heading bugs. And if you don't have one, although you really should, then find some substitute that will remind you of altitudes and heading assignments. Dial each new altitude heading frequency into the altitude alerter, the heading bug, the radio first, then read back what you dialed in. That way you can't read it back correctly and then dial it in wrong. Use your autopilot, especially when your attention is diverted from the flight instruments for any reason. Professional pilots use their autopilot most of the time, and a lot of them have two or three pilots in the cockpit, but they still use the autopilot. Your job really should not be flying the airplane; it should be monitoring, and let George fly the airplane. If you have any doubt about an ATC clearance, if there's any chance it might have been intended for another aircraft, always ask for verification. I find myself doing that a fair amount. I had yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I had a clearance issued, but the first part of the call sign got stepped on. I was pretty sure it was for me, but pretty sure isn't good enough in this business. So I called ATC and I said, verify that clearance was for November 2638 X-ray. You just need to be, cautious on these things. If you miss an approach at your destination, it's probably a sucker's bet to try the approach a second time. It's probably not going to get better, and you're probably not going to get less fatigue. So the better part of valor is generally to divert to somewhere else where the weather is good, sort things out on the ground. There are too many pilots that have bought the farm doing second and third try approaches. So, Tim, that's about all I have as far as prepared stuff, and I will be happy to do some Q&A if we have time.
Okay, Mike. Yeah, we got plenty of time here. We do have some questions that have come in so far, so let's start right off with Ray's question at the top. He says, in hard IFR, what temp above 0 do you recommend for winter flying?
Well, I'm not clear on the question. I guess the question has to do with structural icing. one of the things that's important is to make sure that you have accurate OAT information in the cockpit. I've discovered that OAT gauges frequently are several degrees off. In the case of my aircraft, I put an outside air temperature sensor on my JPI engine monitor, which gives me a digital OAT display, and it also gives me the ability to program a correction factor into the instrument. And then what I will do is, if I'm picking up a little rime ice or something, I will descend and note exactly when the ice starts to melt. And if my OAT readout is not reading 0, I will adjust the fudge factor in the instrument so that it reads exactly 0 right at the melting point of water. But I think the general recommendation for aircraft that are not certified for flight into known icing, which my airplane is so certified, but is to avoid flying in visible moisture at temperatures below 4 degrees Celsius, just to give a little bit of a buffer.
Let's go with Matt's question. What's your opinion as to why 70% of heading deviations occur during departure?
Okay, I don't know the answer to that. I found that one of the things that was kind of counterintuitive in the study, and I really don't know the reason for that. I would not have expected that, but that's what the study showed.
Philip's wondering, shouldn't the yoke-mounted devices be considered not IFR certified and may present issues to be on the correct course assigned by ATC because they're portable?
There's no regulation preventing us from using all sorts of supplemental displays and so on. And if they aren't physically attached to the aircraft, they don't need to be certified. We can't shoot an approach using a non-certified thing as our primary guidance, but we can use it as a supplemental to help us improve our situational awareness, and we really should be doing that.
Okay, Drew's wondering, the RNAV approaches are new since this study. Any suggestions for avoiding problems with those beyond what you have suggested?
Well, not really. The RNAV approaches are either non-precision approaches or precision approaches. The precision approaches have pretty much the same characteristics as ILSs, except they're even easier to fly because the course width is constant rather than narrowing as you approach the runway. And the non-precision RNAV approaches are pretty much the same as any non-precision approach. So I wouldn't expect the RNAV approaches to really make any changes in terms of what the survey found.
Okay. David's wondering if you have any recommendations reference ATC and transition from tower to departure to en route frequencies to deal with high pilot load conditions.
Yes. The basic rule is that talking to ATC is always at the very, very end of the list. What was it? We're flying the airplane first, we're navigating second, we're talking third. And so it's not uncommon for me to get a frequency change and not show up on that other frequency for a couple minutes while I'm getting everything else squared away. It's the lowest priority thing. I normally will will dial a frequency in and switch the radio. And if ATC is in a real hurry to get a hold of me, he'll call me first. But I will typically make sure that everything else is squared away in the cockpit before I contact ATC. It's the lowest priority thing that what we do. And I've seen too many accidents occur where a pilot receives an ATC instruction. This is particularly true with low-time pilots. Acts as if God just spoke to him, drops everything else, and does what ATC told him to. And sometimes with tragic consequences. I lost a client who was actually literally a brain surgeon flying a Cirrus, who was a relatively low-time instrument pilot, took off into a low overcast. Just as he was entering the overcast, ATC gave him a heading change and a frequency change, and 15 seconds later, he was a smoking hole in the ground because he was focusing on the heading change and frequency change rather than flying the airplane at this very critical moment at low altitude. So we have to make talking to ATC our very last priority.
Robert's wondering, has descent or climb via clearances contributed to this problem?
Not to my knowledge. That's mostly just a change in terminology, but I wouldn't really expect it to cause a lot of problems. And at least so far in my experience, that those kinds of clearances aren't issued all that often.
Okay, David's wondering, do you have a recommendation for treating de-ice boots prior to flight into icing conditions?
Sure. There's what is the product called? ICEX, which is a very slippery silicone thing that you put on your boots before departing, and it greatly reduces ice adhesion. So if you're flying in serious icing weather in a booted airplane, it's always a good idea to put some ICEX on it before departure. It goes on really, really quickly, and it's usually the last thing. During the winter, if there's icing potential, it's usually the last thing I do before I pull the airplane out of the hangar is just take a rag and wipe a film of this ICEX on the boots. The ICEX is not the stuff that preserves the boots. That's something else. But ICEX is the release agent. It's just a slippery silicone coating that goes on the boots to make it hard for ice to adhere to them.
Okay. Robert making a comment, it would be interesting to repeat the study comparing glass cockpit with 3-axis autopilot versus the older 6-pack with both using GPS nav units. He says, I have great situational awareness with the G3X autopilot and GNS 430. The tablet has the approach plates. Comments about, I guess, new technology and the new all the increased situational awareness this new technology can bring.
I agree that it would be very interesting to have a study like this done again nowadays. I don't know that there's any plans at NASA to do this, and I'm not sure if there's any way to if they have a suggestion box for the ASRS system, but it would be quite interesting to do a survey like this again, say on the last 5 years of data, and see how the statistics have changed over the years.
Michael's wondering, does scanning in a conventional aircraft differ much from scanning in a glass cockpit for single pilot ops?
Well, it's a lot easier with the glass cockpit because your eyes don't have to move as much because so much information is concentrated together in the area that used to be your your attitude indicator, you now have pretty much everything you need to see all in one place with altitudes and headings and traffic and weather and everything all displayed in one place. So it makes the scanning process much easier.
Bill's wondering, what's your advice for how best to use ATC for avoiding convective weather?
Well, it's ATC nowadays has much better weather displays than they used to have, and the weather that they're looking at is real time, as opposed to the weather we're looking at on our downlinked satellite displays, either XM weather or FIS weather, which can be several minutes old. It can be, in extreme cases, as much as maybe 10 minutes old. So the in-cockpit weather that we have is great to get the big picture. But if we're getting close into the weather and need tactical information as opposed to strategic information, it's always a really good idea to ask ATC what they're seeing, because what they're seeing is probably several minutes newer than what we're seeing on our in-cockpit displays, assuming that you don't have weather radar in the aircraft, which I don't.
Daniel's wondering, if I usually fly an approach with half flaps at 90 knots, when is the right time to switch to full flaps and my 70 knots final speed? If I fly an ILS to minimum 200 AGL, seems like a bad time to make these changes.
Well, I would not go to landing flaps until you had visually acquired the runway and had landing assured. And in the case of a 200.5 ILS, typically the best bet is to just land with approach flaps. Most ILS runways are going to be longer than you need, as a general rule, and there's nothing wrong with not going to full flaps. But going to full flaps before you break out on an ILS is, first of all, you're destabilizing what should have been a stabilized approach. And then second of all, if you wind up having to go missed, you've got a whole bunch of drag out there that you have to deal with. So my recommendation would be not to go full flaps until you have visual contact with the runway and landing assured. And if the weather is really low, then you might want to just go ahead and land with approach flaps and just use a little more runway.
Ryan's wondering, you stress using autopilot. Sorry if I missed it, but was there data behind that? Do the numbers show that autopilots are safer than not?
The Battelle report did not comment on the use of autopilots. During this webinar, I've been sort of oscillating back and forth between reporting what the Battelle study found and then giving my opinion on what can be done, what pilots can do to reduce the incidence of these problems. And the recommendation for using the autopilot as much as possible is my recommendation, not one that came from the Battelle report, just to make that clear.
Got it. Hey, question from Tim. Tim says, I hear the term stabilized approach all the time these days. What exactly is the definition of a stabilized approach?
Well, there's actually a formal definition of it now in the new instrument ACS which is the thing that replaced the PTS. And there's actually a formal definition of a stabilized approach. And I'm embarrassed because I just finished doing a flight review, and that was one of the questions that I was asked, and I'm blocking on the answer right now as to what exactly the parameters are. But I think that if I'm recalling correctly, a stabilized approach is one in which there are no configuration changes or major changes in descent rate during the last below, I believe, 1,000 feet of altitude. That in other words, that you're supposed to be on speed in final approach configuration by the time you get to 1,000 feet, and if you're not, you're supposed to go missed and do it again.
Okay, Jeremy's asking, what do you personally do to stay current at single pilot IFR? Obviously more than the FAA minimums, or what do you recommend to do?
Well, I normally do instrument proficiency checks every 6 months. In fact, I just did my most recent one 2 weeks ago with a designated pilot examiner back east, and I do most of my instrument recurrent training in the simulator because it's a much more it's much more intensive. You can get a lot more done in a given amount of time than you can the airplane. Plus, the sim is a lot harder to fly than an airplane is because you have less feedback. And so, if you're good in the sim, then the airplane's going to be very easy. And so, I do a lot of training in the simulator. But the other thing I do is I file on virtually 100% of my flights. I'm always amazed at how many pilots who are instrument rated don't file IFR unless they absolutely have to. I'm just the opposite. I always file IFR on every flight, even if it's severe clear. I'm always in the system. I'm always talking to ATC. I'm always on a clearance. I figure I pay a lot of taxes to support this system, and by Jove, I'm gonna get my money's worth out of it.
Right.
But I know a lot of instrument pilots that for some reason prefer not to fly IFR and fly VFR anytime they can, and fly IFR only if they must. To me, that's a very strange philosophy, although it's a pretty common one.
Gary's got a question. How do you feel about a storm scope for thunderstorm avoidance?
I have a storm scope in my airplane, and I find it next to useless. The availability of downlink satellite weather, satellite NEXRAD, and so on has pretty much ended the usefulness of the storm scope in my view. And in fact, my airplane is going into the avionics shop for ADS-B out and a bunch of stuff. And I'm very seriously thinking about just removing the storm scope from the airplane.
Question from Dale. Do you recommend turning multiple step-down approaches into a continuous descent approach?
That's never been my practice. I suppose it's possible, but I've always flown non-precision approaches, one step down at a time with a level off.
Okay.
Of course,
Question.
more and more we're more and more with WAS and so on, we're getting continuous descent approaches, but for non-precision approaches, I've always flown them, basically as published with the step downs.
Yeah, Yeah. Question from Ben. Ben is a 400-hour VFR pilot just starting his IFR training, and he's hungry for information. What publication or training would teach me the best practices in real-world single-pilot IFR, similar to the suggestions that you have made this evening? Not looking to just pass the test, but more so desire to avoid making deviations as an instrument pilot.
There are two Belvoir magazines, one called IFR and the other called IFR Refresher, both of which are very good. And if you're a up and coming instrument pilot, I would suggest subscribing to them. There's a lot of great reading material there.
Cool. John's wondering, what do you use to fix your iPad to your left cockpit window? And then which software program do you use to follow your flight position on your iPad?
I use I have an iPad mini. I use a mount that I purchased off Amazon, and I can't recall what the exact brand name is, but it's a suction cup mount. And I use ForeFlight on the iPad and also on my iPhone, which I also have in the cockpit. So I guess I got 4 GPS moving maps going in my cockpit at any given time.
Okay, RAM mount. Somebody commented in here. Is it a RAM mount maybe you have?
It actually is not a RAM mount. The RAM mount's a pretty big and bulky thing. The one I have is much lighter and more compact than the RAM mount. I do use a RAM mount for my yoke mount, but I don't use a RAM mount on the cockpit window for the iPad mini.
Okay. Hey, Ray's wondering, do you know, will a pilot deviation occur if separation is not affected?
No, it won't. And in fact, I've been known when ATC says, 3 at X-ray, where are you going, or something's equally incriminating. I've been known to say to the controller, was there a loss of separation? And if he says no, then I won't bother to file a NASA report because I know nothing's going to happen.
Interesting. Linda is asking, what does ATC expect us to do when they say expect a visual approach? What do they expect us to do when we transition from IMC to visual approach?
Tim, I really don't understand the question.
Well, let's start with the first part here. Yeah, what does ATC expect us to do when they say expect a visual approach?
That's just telling us what they're gonna give us unless we ask for something different so that we can plan ahead and be ready for it.
Okay. And do they have any expectation of us when we transition from IMC to the visual approach?
Well, they can't issue the visual approach to you unless you either have the airport in sight or have the preceding aircraft in sight. And they can't give you a visual approach unless the weather is, I don't know, it's considerably higher than VFR. So when you're cleared for visual approach, IMC is not an issue because they can't even give you a visual approach unless you're pretty severe VFR.
Gotcha.
Larry, with the airport in sight.
Yep. A question from Larry. How do you handle an unexpected handoff in crowded airspace frequency, like to an adjacent Class D off the expected route?
Well, again, I don't really understand the question. When you're IFR, you don't care about any of that class airspace. It's not your problem. That's one of the reasons I always fly IFR. I don't have to worry about what class of airspace I'm in. That's ATC's problem. All I got to do is follow instructions. So the class of airspace is irrelevant when you're on an IFR flight plan.
Hey, just a comment here from Michelle for the 400-hour IFR student. Pilotworkshop.com, especially IFR mastery and real-world IFR, is useful for gaining more insights. Just a comment there from Michelle. Pilotworkshops.com, IFR mastery and real-world IFR. Kind of getting to the end of the questions here, Mike. Let's see here. We had a couple people come in on the stabilized approach. I think you nailed it. 1,000-foot, fully configured on speed, power set. Yeah, I think that's pretty much what you said there for a stabilized approach. Andrew's wondering about Wings credit. Wings credit will be automatic as long as the email address you logged into tonight's webinar with is the same email address on your account on FAAsafety.gov.
No AMT credit tonight. Sorry.
Oh, right. Just Wings tonight. Yep. No AMT, just Wings. It's all right. And then if for some reason you're logged into the webinar tonight with a different email than your account on FAAsafety.gov, use the questions pane, type in your email address for FAA Safety so I can get that credit. Okay, cool. Well, let's wrap her up here then, Mike. Please share closing comments you want with the audience, please.
Okay, well, as always, if you haven't already done so, I would invite you to sign up for my monthly newsletter at savvyaviation.com or check the checkbox during the post-webinar survey that Tim's going to put up in the next couple minutes. My book manifesto is available on Amazon. And I'm working on my new book. It's going to be a big one. Should be in time for AirVenture 2018. Working with my editor and my book designer right now to get that together. It looks like it's going to be 300 plus pages. If you're interested in getting advanced copies of the manuscripts of the chapters as I develop them and having some input on the book as it develops, you can support my work on Patreon at patreon.com/savvyaviator. And finally, the next three first Wednesday of the month webinars coming up in December. Grand Theft Propeller as a semi-humorous webinar about something that's not humorous at all for aircraft owners, and that is whether a mechanic can hold an aircraft or part of an aircraft hostage if he doesn't think it's airworthy, and so we're going to get into that. January 3rd, a webinar called Liticophobia, which is fear of being sued, where we'll be talking about the effect on aircraft owners of mechanics' fear of being sued. And in my experience, mechanics have pretty much a siege mentality when it comes to being concerned about liability. So we'll take a look at that, look at what the perception of mechanics is, what the actual facts are, and how an aircraft owner can best deal with this fear of being sued that mechanics have. And finally, the February webinar is entitled "What? No Smoking Gun," and it talks about the frustrations that we have when we have an airplane problem that magically fixes itself and we never are able to find what caused it. I had an incident like that about 3 weeks ago with my own airplane while I was on the East Coast, and I'll tell you about that and tell you about a couple of other similar incidents. And so that's what we'll be talking about in the February webinar. And Tim, that is all I have for this evening. And sorry about all of the audio interruptions.
Okay, Mike. Hey, thank you so much for tonight's webinar. It was really interesting. I liked a little bit different subject than what you normally do. I think it was very appropriate. We had a nice turnout here. Boy, 475 people, I think, were logged in. So it was a great,
fabulous.
Yeah, great turnout. So thank you so much for sharing this information with us. Really appreciate it. And for all the folks who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for tuning in. And hope you can join us next week. Have a great night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.